we're taking a look at the Dvar Avraham here, Shut Dvar Avraham Chelik Aleph Simon Tes Zayin. And I think there's something very fundamental here that really demands our attention if we're learning the sugis of Hafara and Hakamah. And he says the following, towards the end of the first top line, De b'chol mili kagon gitin v'kiddushin v'dinei momenos, afal gav de dvarim shebelev lo mahani behu. We have a principle that the Gemara establishes in Kiddushin, and that's a sugya of Kiddushin daf mem tesam it beis, that dvarim shebelev lo avi dvarim, and the Torah does not consider and grant any chashivus to dvarim shebelev, BIyun dibur dafka, so that when he gives the get, he should be stipulating verbally hareze gitech, and the same with regard to kiddushin and dinim ominous. He has to express that he's interested in entering into a sale in order for that transaction to be valid. Mikol makom, nevertheless, the Gemara establishes in kiddushin on daf mem that be asukim be also inyan o beumnil sachriti de muchache mahani. If we have circumstantial evidence, then it operates and validates the transaction even in the absence of dibur. And the reason for that is, he says, as we'll soon see, that dibur in the cases of gittin kiddushin and dinim ominous is only a hechi timtza. It's only what we call in modern Hebrew, thank you, an emtsai. It's not a tachlis. In other words, the kinyan is effectuated with or without dibur, just that we don't know whether he's really serious about the transaction. So that's why we need dibur. Aval bin Nedarim, right, so Chaim, we have these two pages. We're looking at the page that's on top. It says Shut Dvar Avraham, and we're on the fourth line. B'nedarim be'inan ad sheyetze bisvasav. With regard to Nedarim, it's not enough that we can evaluate his das and his interest, his ratzon in creating a neder, but the neder is not chal ad sheyotze bisvasav. Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Even if we could somehow prove and establish without any doubt, with all certainty, that he intended b'machshavto to take upon himself a neder. Let's say he would make movements, body movements or so. And afilu ba'oskim ba'oso inyan, even if, let's say, they were dealing and discussing the possibility of taking a neder, nami, with regard to Nedarim, there's no halacha of umdana demuchach that could substitute for yotzi bisvasav. Even if we would be absolutely convinced that he wants to take upon himself a neder, they were discussing it, and then he said, yeah, that's a good idea, and I want to be in that same position. It's not enough. Ad sheyotzi bisvasav mamish. So here's the contrast between Nedarim on the one hand and kol mili and everything else like gittin kiddushin dinim ominous on the other hand. And that means that in Nedarim, all the proofs and all the circumstantial evidence would not suffice. We need yotzi bisvasav. In contrast, with regard to gittin kiddushin dinim ominous, if we understand from the context that he indeed wants to make and enter into this transaction, then we can rely on what's called umdana demuchach, and we can validate the kinyan or validate the gittin or kiddushin. So let's say they were sitting down at the table discussing who's going to chip in for this wedding and who's going to pay for this dowry and so forth and so on. And then he gets up at the table and he gives our kesef kiddushin. Then, since they were oskim ba'oso inyan, the kiddushin is valid. That would not work by Nedarim. In Nedarim, the critical key of keys in order to generate the chalos haneder is what? Sheyotzi bisvasav mamish. Hare liyoros Nedarim. Let's say we have an expression, a verbal declaration of a neder, but it was incomplete. Tzrichi Kroi, we need psukim to derive the conclusion shehem k'nedarim, that they are valid. V'hainu b'yadayim ochichos, and we need, according to Rava, an absolute proof that with this incomplete language of the neder, his intention was to take upon himself the neder. Ha'ilav kra, if not for the pasuk from which we derive yadayim of nedarim k'nedarim lo havi adin lahu, we would not know that this would be valid, even though afal gav de muchache, even though we're dealing with yadayim ochichos, it's not enough, because we need what? Motzi bisfasav. Neder could only be generated by dibur. El de'asi kroyu mar b'liyados. The Torah in a special ribui tells me that even a yad neder is considered motzi bisfasav. The kevan shehotzi bipiv miktas dibur zeres hakosavu dechoshev ke kvar hotzi kulo misfasav. The Torah says that a miktas dibur is enough to constitute and qualify as kulo dibur, as hotza misfasav. Okay, ubir ha'inyan pashutu. He says we can explain this distinction in a very simple way. Dibur plays really no major role in effectuating neither a get, nor kiddushin, nor a mecher. It doesn't say in any of these parshios yotzis fasasov that he has to verbalize it. So what is the purpose of dibur when he says harei zegitech, or harei et mekudeshesli, or harei maknes sadezulecha? Eina dibur osa makayim behemes hadavar. The dibur is not there to effectuate the kinyan or the gerushin or the kedushin. Ella hakesef haget vakinyanin. Uchedoma, all these maisim, these actions of giving kesef, giving a get, are what effectuates the davar, makaymi davar. The chalos is effectuated by the maisa kinyan, by the maisa gerish and the maisa kedushin. Ella, so why do we need dibur? Tzrichim sheyadu alanu shenasa miratzon abal davar. We have to know that the bal davar here has ratzon. Ulazen, therefore, BIyun dibur, we need dibur. But the dibur, he says, legalos lanu ratzon abal davar. We only need the dibur in a secondary capacity, so that we know now that when he's delivering this get, he really means it. And when he gives a kesef kedushin, he's really interested in being makadisha, and so forth in kinyonim. Hilkoch, therefore, if the dibur is only playing a secondary role, and it's really the maisa kinyan that effectuates the chalos, if we have indications without a dibur that he's interested in this kiddushin, like we described before, and even though he didn't express himself verbally, shaper mahani, it will be effective. Why? We know his ratzon, and he did the maisa gerish and the maisa kedushin and the maisa kinyan. Zeva ikar. The sagibe, in other words, dibur is not a halacha in and of itself. There's nothing inherently important or significant about the dibur. The dibur is only an emtsa'i, as he calls it, to reveal his ratzon, his desire for the get. And if we can prove his ratzon in other ways, by circumstantial evidence, umder demuchach, then the maisa gerushin is meaningful, and we don't need dibur. Aval b'nedarim, in contrast, neder fits into a category of its own. Be'ina dibur dafka, Kirichsim, and this we derive from the pasuk Levate Bisvasayin. The parsha in Matos of Nedarim adds the words Levate Bisvasayim. So what generates the chalos neder? It's the dibur, it's the bitis vasayim. What generates the chalos kinyan? It's the maisa kinyan. The dibur in the case of kinyanim of kinyan kedushin is only secondary, so that we know and it's clear that he is interested in this transaction. If we can determine that without dibur, fine. Dibur is secondary; it's not significant in of itself. And mishum hachi, but in the case of nedarim, where the Torah requires what? What generates the neder? Not his machshava, his decision, but rather his dibur. And even if we can understand his machshava, and we can somehow read his mind, I feel be oskim bo so inyan, and machshavta nikeres mitoch masav, we have an umded the muchara circumstantial evidence that he wants the neder, nami lo mahani lamashve neder, because we need what? We need bitus fasayim. And in the absence of bitus, now in the case of Yadayim, which is not a complete bitus fasayim, we have exeris akosim, we derive from psukim that yados linedarim havi kenidarim, that if he uses a yad, that yad is considered a bitus fasayim, as if he, with a mixas dibur, had expressed a full-fledged dibur. But in the case where he doesn't have any dibur at all, not even yodayim, even with all the hochachos in the world and all the oskim boso inyan and circumstantial evidence that we can pile up, afal pisha ritzono muchach, we have no doubt about his will to take the neder. Mikoma komare lo hotzi bisvasav. He did not generate the neder, because to generate the neder you need what? Dibur. V'la bitus v'sayimhu. And all of the proofs that we can deduce from circumstantial evidence that he wants and desires the neder is not a substitute for bitus v'sayim. Only yodayim could be considered a dibur, in which case the Torah declares that mixas dibur can dibur. Now, the Dvar Avram wants to point out that there is one relevance of umdana demuchach within the framework of Nedarim. What is that? In the case of the 4 Nedarim that don't require ataras Nedarim, for example, you have nidre zrizin and so forth and so on, and therefore, even though Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam, and in Nedarim everything depends upon his dibur, but nevertheless, when it comes to bittul, in order to be mavatel his bitus v'sayim, shelo yehei nedro neder, which means that now we see that he really made a mistake, and circumstantial evidence convinces us beyond a shadow of a doubt that he never meant to take the neder. So then the neder is not chal, but that's because the umdana is powerful and effective to be mavatel the bitus v'sayim. But you can never have an umdana that would substitute for bitus v'sayim. So there are basically 2 conditions to generate a valid neder. One is bitus v'sayim, and the second is that he wants the neder. We can use umdana demucha to determine whether or not he wants the neder, but that's not going to generate the neder. What we need is a dibur, a bitus v'sayim. Ultimately, after he has das and full-fledged desire to accept upon himself this neder, what generates the neder is the bitus v'sayim, as opposed to the Maisa Gerushin and Kedushin, where what generates the chalos Kedushin and Gerushin and Kinyan is what? Is the Maisa Kinyan. We only need a dibur as a gilui das to reveal to us what his ratzon is. Therefore, umdana demuchach will substitute for dibur, and be oskim be also inyan, the kedushin will be chal, because he does the Maisa Kedushin. But in Nedarim, the fact that he has Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam, even with an umdana demuchach, that's not worth a dime until he's motzi bisfasayim. Now, the balance of this paragraph is about hefker, and because we're pressed for time, as we always are, I'm going to skip that. And we're going to go to the next paragraph, ubazeh. Ubazeh tisyashev kusha chamura sheinicha agon Reb Kiva Eiger zal b'tzarech ian gadol. B'nedarim daf ayin tes. Now, I just want to point out here a very important footnote in the Otzer Hayunim, which is in your phone from a week ago, and he says the following. He says in footnote number Zion, it's a very short footnote. He says, the Hainu came in Shenet ben Neder, Hakol Nasa b'klapa v'lo klapi kol ha'olam. He adds a comment here in the footnote that why is it that if not for the pasuk bitus v'sayim, what would have been our assumption, if not for the Gzeres HaKosav, that you need a bitus v'sayim? Anybody?
That you don't necessarily need dibur.
Why? Why would the neder be chal? What would generate the neder without dibur? In the Havamina, before the Torah added those two words, bitis v'sayim.
Any other way of showing some kind of Maisa that?
No. Forget about the Maisa. Machshava itself would have generated the neder. So the Dvar of Ram is telling us that there was a Havamina and a Maskana. The Havamina was our logical conclusion about the nature of neder and what generates a neder. And then the Maskana is based on Exeris HaKosav of Levatis V'Sayim. In the Havamina, what would we have thought, says the Dvar of Ram, what would generate a neder if you don't have Bitis V'Sayim? Yes, the Machshava, correct, the Das. So he adds a comment here, which I thought was very insightful. He doesn't need my Hakamah, but that why would we have ever had a Havamina that Nedarim would be generated by Machshava? In the case of Gittin and Kiddushin or any Kinyan, there was never a Havamina that Machshava alone, without a Maisa Kinyan, without a Maisa Gerishin, Maisa Kiddushin, would generate a Chalos. Why in Nedarim would Machshava be effective if not for the pasuk of Levati B'Svasayim?
Well, there's another person. There's another side.
Exactly.
Involved.
That's what he says over here. Yeah, Doc, what do you want to say?
So it would be the opposite side. In other words, the assumption that you're saying to start with is, had it not been for Levati B'Svasayim, we would have thought that Machshava alone is works.
Why?
But when maybe you could have started from the other end. If we wouldn't have Levati B'Svasayim, we would have thought you would have needed to do a Maisa of some sort to effectuate a there.
So the Dvar from says that in the Havamina before Levatis V'Sayim, there was no Havamina that you need a Maisa to generate a neder.
Right.
And there was not even a Havamina that you need Levatis V'Sayim to generate the neder. All you would need is Machshava Greda. And he adds a comment here. Why would neder be different than Gittin, Kiddushin, and Kinyanim? Why in Gittin, Kiddushin, Kinyanim it never was a Havamina? It didn't cross anyone's mind that your decision to sell your field would effectuate a Kinyan. And he says because neder is beino levein atzmo, nasa klapa. Do you see that? V'lo klapi kol ha'olam. If I'm trying to effectuate something that will impact on you, namely that you now acquire ownership, so I am bequeathing my possession to you, transferring ownership, then for sure you need a Maisa, and Machshava would not do it. But in Nedarim, he says, Bein Adam lebein Atzmo, therefore there was a Havamina, if not for the pasuk Levatis V'Sayim, that Machshava alone would do it.
That fits actually very well with this earlier comment about Hefker, because Hefker is also a Kinyan without the second side.
Correct,
and
therefore to say...
It might not be a Kenyan, right? Didn't we ever solve that?
Okay. So let me just see how he answers Rabbi Kivega's kasha. The Gemara says, Kiyeh belibo kiyeh, kayam. It's valid. Imagine a man decides that his wife's neder should be chal. He approves of his neder. Belibo. Didn't mention a thing to anyone. Never whispered a word. But hafer belibo eino mufar. In order for the husband to implement his rights to negate the neder, he must express it verbally. That which he decided in his heart that he wants to disapprove and invalidate the neder, that's meaningless. But in the case of kiyum neder, his decision in his heart is valid to be Mekayim the neder. Now, Rabbi Kivega attacks the Ran. The Ran says, how do we know that a decision in the heart of the husband to be Mekayim the neder is effective and is Mekayim the neder? Nir be'enai, says the Ran, quote, the alfina la mishtika diyom shama. If the Baal is shosek for the entire day that he hears about the neder is mekuyam, and that's in the pasuk. The time of why should the passage of the entire day effectuate a kiyum neder? Says the Ran, Mishum dekevin shavar yom shmua v'lo hefer. The fact that he was silent during the entire day after he heard about his wife's neder, and he did not exercise his right to what? To nullify the neder through Hafara. Goli daito, it's what we would call an uvda de demuchach, sherotze b'kiyumo shel neder. He wants the kiyum neder. Alma, what do we see? Kol shebelibo lekaimo. Whoops, are we okay?
Yeah.
I don't know if we have insurance here. All right.
High quality.
So Rabbosai, why would it be that if we know by the fact that he did not exercise his ability to be made for the neder, at the end of the day, with nightfall, that's called kiyum neder. That's based on umdina demucha, right? The fact that the day passed, it means that we're not going to apply the principle of Dvarim She'lo Ba LeOlam Dvarim. He never actually enunciated his kiyum, and yet the Torah says that it is a kiyum. Why is it a kiyum? Because we have an umdina demucha.
There's Xeris Akafu related to the Yom Shmuah.
Okay, but how could Yom Shmuah be effective without adding, again, there's Xeris HaKosuv, but what do we derive from the Xeris HaKosuv? Okay. We're learning from this Xeris HaKosuv that if we know for sure that the Baal is approving of the neder, that itself is a kiyum. And the principle of Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam Dvarim will not apply when there's an umdina demucha. El diyav le'rachmana, kol ahu yoma, Hafara. We're going to wait the whole, let's call it 24 hours, going to that shita of the Zug, you remember. And he did not exercise his Hafara, because until that period of time passes, we don't have an umdina demucha. Maybe he's thinking it over, maybe he will be made for the neder. But if his allotted period of time for Hafara passes, then we know that he has accepted the neder. He, begrudgingly, if you will, approves of the neder because he didn't exercise his rights to disapprove of the neder. So therefore, we see that with regard to kiyum neder, we're going to accept the kiyum neder even though there was never a verbal declaration that I hereby approve of the neder. Those words never came out of his mouth. The day passed, and we assume that he's happy with the neder or accepts the neder. And therefore the neder is mekuyah. And therefore, says the Ran, in a case where he was makayim the neder belibo, that kiyum will be chal. And you see, says the Ran, from the fact that b'yom shoma, you don't need a verbal declaration of kiyum, as opposed to what? Hafara, which requires a verbal declaration. And therefore, in the case of kiyum shebelev, havi kiyum. Reb Kiveger attacks this. Ma raya miyom shmiyah. He says, even though Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam Dvarim, but nevertheless, we have a principle called Hayu Oskim Bioso Inyan, or an umdina demuchach, and once we have an umdina demuchach, it's no longer Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam. It becomes Dvar She'belibo B'chol Adam. It becomes objective. So it's true that you don't need a verbal declaration in order for the kiyum neder to be chal, but says Rabbi Kivega, at the very least, what do you need? You need an umdina demuchach. We have to know for sure, by virtue of circumstantial evidence, the day passed, he did not exercise his rights to what? To be made for the neder. Is ma raya he divishasa kol yom shmiyah. There we're going to operate with regard with what? With the principle of umdina demucha, and that's mafkia dvarim shebelev lo havi dvarim. In mishum hachi, therefore, even though he didn't verbalize his kiyum, the kiyum is chal. Avol kiyum belibo. In the case of kiyum belibo, in the middle of the day, he heard about the neder and he decided in his mind. But we don't read minds. And he decided he wants to approve of the neder. Eino muchach v'gali l'kol. We don't have an umdina demuchach, and therefore we go back to dvarim shebelev lo havi dvarim. What is the proof in the Ran from the case of umdina demuchach? And he leaves it with tzarach and gadol, the famous tzarach and gadol of Rabbi Kiveger. Says the Dvar Avraham, Lefi anal miyusha beravcha. Beravcha means gleich, it's smooth, without any docha. V'tuv tam. And we can now understand the Ran. Oh, but we have to add one more introduction. And that is the hekem le'inyan nederhu. I'm going to prove to you, says the Dvar Avraham, and this is a Ran later on Daf Samach Tes, I think it is. I'll tell you in a minute. And the Ran says that as far as Kiyum HaNeder is concerned, the Gemara establishes that Nisholim ala Hekem, that after the Baal was Makayim the Neder, he could be Shoel on his Hakamah. And then it goes back to being a Neder without Kiyum, and now he could be made for the Neder. So that's called She'ela al Hakamah. Oh, Taka, I was right. It's a Gemara Daf Ayin Tes. Nisholim al hahekem. The Ran on Daf Samach Tes. Okay, if you want to look it up, Dibra Maskil Boy or Rishon, which whenever I say that, I mean, please do me a favor and look it up so I don't have to take the time. Shagak behekem yesh she'ela. Why is it that hekem is subject to she'ela? Al Hafara ein ba she'ela. Says the Ran that the reason why she'ela operates with regard to Hakamah is mishum she'Hakamah, this is the language of the Ran, he ke'ein neder. In other words, when you are makayim the neder as a husband, then basically it's as if you took the neder. So the Hakamah has the status of what? Of a neder. And yet, and therefore, since Hakamah has the status of a neder, explains the Ran, therefore, just like in the case of a neder, you could what? You could be matu the neder. So too, in the case of Hakamah, you could be matu the Hakamah. That's called sholim al Hakamah. Says the Dvar from Lefizeh. Now, wait a second. If the Hakamah is like taking a neder, and that's why it lends itself to what? To she'ela, therefore, we should, what halacha should kick in? The halacha bitis v'sayim. The Torah says that what generates a neder? Bitis v'sayim. If which case, as we said with regard to the Nedarim, can we operate with Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam? We know this person wanted to take a neder. We're absolutely certain about it. Will the neder be chal? No. Why not? Because it says bitus v'sayim. If not for bitus v'sayim, it would have been chal with what? With machshava. But now that we have bitus v'sayim, a neder could only be chal with bitus v'sayim, and Dvar She'lo Ba LeOlam would not be enough, even in a case where we have what? Why? Because the Torah says you need bitus v'sayim. So why is it in the case of Hakamah, we're going to say that Hakamah, although it has a quasi status of a neder, nevertheless, Hakamah shebelev havi Hakamah. Says the Dvar Avraham that we're going to see from Shtika b'Yom Shamo that Hakamah is not like a neder, 100%. It's partially like a neder because it lends itself to what? To she'ela, but it's not a neder gamur, in which case, if it would have been an neder gomer, then bitus v'sayim would have kicked in, and umdin and demucha wouldn't have operated. So what shtika b'yom shama? Rabbi Kiveger admits he doesn't disagree with the Ran that shtika b'yom shama operates midin what? Umdin and demucha. But how could it operate midin umdin and demucha in order to be makayim the neder when in the halach of Nedarim we need what? We need bitus v'sayim. The answer must be that the Torah in the parsha of shtika b'yom Shamo is telling me that this Hakamah is not exactly like a neder. And the principle of bitus v'sayim to make a verbal Hakamah is not applicable with regard to Hakamah. Memela says that Avraham, with regard to Hakamah, we have to go back to what would have been the status of a neder without the Gzeres HaKos of bitus v'sayim. In other words, Shtika b'Yom Shamo, the Torah is telling me that Hakamah, although it's like a neder, it's not subject to the requirement of bitus v'sayim, and therefore b'Yom Shamo, if he's shosek, it accomplishes Hakamah, and Hakamah will be chal. How can it be chal with bitus v'sayim? The answer is that we suspend the requirement of bitus v'sayim. Now in Nedarim, what would have been the halacha without bitus v'sayim? It'd be chal be machshava, and therefore kiyum neder on the part of the husband will be chal with machshava without bitus v'sayim, and therefore memela nilmad mizeh the kiyum shebelev mahani afilu b'delo muchacha daite. Now the Ran is shall I say is redeemed and is justified in deriving the conclusion that kiyum shebelev havi kiyum from shtika b'yom shamo, because shtika b'yom shamo now reverts the status of kiyum to that of a neder before the gzeres hakos of bitus v'sayim, because in kiyum b'yom shamo there is no bitus v'sayim, and apparently that level of a neder with regard to kiyum is not subject to the requirement of bitus v'sayim, and if it's not, then we go back, we revert to our original position. That what? That Dvarim shebelev havi Dvar with regard to Nedarim. Why? Because the Nedarim is chal b'machshava. It says bitus v'sayim, that's the Gzeres HaKosim. So when the Torah says bitus v'sayim, then the neder can only be generated by bitus v'sayim, and all the umdus in the world will not help you. Why? Because even though we have a gili das that he wants the neder, he never actually effectuate the neder with bitus v'sayim. But if lu yitzuri, we would have a neder which was not subject to bitus v'sayim. What would generate that neder? It would be the machshava. The machshava alone would generate the neder. Says the Dvar Avraham, in the case of kiyum, although kiyum is like a neder, but it's a neder without the requirement of bitus v'sayim, and that the Ran proves from what? From shtik of Yom Shamo. Nu, if the neder of kiyum is without the restriction and the condition of bitus v'sayim, the mele it's like a neder before bitus v'sayim, and it's chal b'machshava. It's mele kiyum shebalev havi kiyum. And he adds, "V'hu pashut ubarur v'ezras Hashem yisbarach." Now, this for me is incredibly important in and of itself. Puts so many things in perspective. But I think it's a great segue to Dvarim Shebalev Lo Havi Dvarim. I'm sorry, excuse me. To Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Okay, then. So now, if you open up your phones,
Can I ask a very quick off-topic question? And I just want a yes or no. Because I'm opening a bit of a can of worms. His
Yeah.
language is Bahari Hefker Ein Sarch. Sorry.
that's it.
Um,
Okay, Doc.
והוא משום לחדש להבוס דבר מה, אי אפשר על במייסה ובדיבר או במחשבה מופחס, המדרם שאינו מחדש או מהווה שום דבר, רק אצל ישראל נשר אליו קרא לבתי הספרים, בגמר בליבו ליחוד הושגי.
What?
בגמר בליבו ליחוד הושגי.
The Gemara believe.
Is he, am I reading too much into it by saying that he's saying for a kinyan or a get, it's something to do with the chefza, chalos and the chefza, whereas neder is just in the gavra?
I don't think, honestly, I'm just going to be straightforward with you. I don't think you're adding anything. Again, I'm sorry if I'm sounding harsh, but
No.
what I mean to say is that Kolamosif Gorea here, by adding Gavra and Chefetz, I think you're just going to confuse yourself. What he's saying is crystal clear.
Right.
He's not saying Gavra Chefetz, he's saying that a neder doesn't effectuate a change in status. There's not an ishus which is chal, there's not a hafkas ishus, there's not a kinyan which is chal. All it does is generates an iser in which I am enjoined from doing X, Y, or Z. In that sense, then Gomer Belibo should be enough to effectuate a neder. I don't know if adding Gavra Chefetz is going to clarify. If it helps you, then go ahead.
Well,
But
there's other nafkaminas about whether you understand neder as a gavra chefza.
I think what
Well,
we're saying
famously,
is, and again, that's why I pointed out this line, which is going to give me a segue into Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, because it could be that Nedarim might be chal in the Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam as opposed to kinyanim.
Which
And
also,
I'm going to try to explain that based on this Dvar Avraham. That's
which
just
also
my
kind of-
chiddush for today.
which-
But again, what I wanted to say is that according to Dvar Avraham, why is Gomer Belibo, if not for the Gzeres HaKosuv of Bitus V'Sayim, operative and valid to generate a neder? And the answer is because Nedarim, you don't change the status of anything. It's not like you've effectuated a kinyan, you've effectuated a gerushin, a kiddushin, you've created ishus. You're not creating anything. You're only generating an Isra al Nafshe. And Isra al Nafshe is really chal b'machshava, except for the pasuk that says levatis v'sayim. Now, once we get to levatis v'sayim, then we shift to the opposite polar extreme. And we're going to say now that all the umdas in the world that prove your machshava are worthless. In the cases of kinyanim, gerushin, and kiddushin, there, if we have an umda de muchach, and we can determine, then we can drop the dibur. But that's because what effectuates the kinyan? The maisa kinyan. But in the case of Nedarim, once the Torah says that the machshava does not effectuate the neder, but what do you need? A bitus v'sayim. Now, Dvarim Shebalev Lavi Dvarim is the most extreme application of that principle, and it's impervious to umdana de muchach. So you can have all the umdanas in the muchach that he wants to take the neder. He did not express it verbally, and therefore the neder is not chal.
The bitus v'sayim that makes the neder, how little can that be? In other words, like if Rabbi Berzon says,
So no, that's
Don't-
called a
Yeah.
yad hamochia. So for that, we'd have to learn, to answer your question, the sugya of Yadayim, Abaye, and Rava. Rava says a yad for a neder has to be a yad mochia. So for example, somebody's passing by and he's a nazir, and I say ve'ani.
right.
So what I'm saying is, or let's say I hear him say, Hareini Nazir, and then I say ve'ani. That's called Yodayim Ochichos. Okay. Now we get to Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Now, in general, I usually use this shir for one of the last 7 dafim in the Masechet that we're learning in Daf Yomi. Today, we're going to change the protocol, and this is going to be the introduction to tomorrow's daf, which I think is going to be meaningful for all of us, because tomorrow's daf goes on and on and on. It's not just one daf, it's the sugya of Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. So, for example, in the case of Nedarim, she takes a neder kona maisi yadai alecha, so she prohibits her husband from enjoying the benefits of her maisi yadayim. And the Gemara says that should be a davar she'lo ba leolam, because she hasn't yet manufactured, the woolen garments that she's going to create. In this essay, in Otzer Hayunim, which is the next to the last essay in Masechet Nedarim, or one of the last, I should say. We're going to have to make a decision next Tuesday, because I think we're making a siyum on Masechet Nedarim. So I was thinking maybe of giving an introduction to Masechet Nazir next Tuesday, just to get an idea what Naziris is all about. Or maybe we'll fit in one more, before we let go of Nedarim, one more shir about Tok Today Dibur Kedibur Dami with regard to Nedarim. In any event, so he presents in this essay a wide range of Rishonim and Achronim, all of whom are addressing the question of why a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam is not chal, which means that you cannot effectuate a kinyan or a Yerusha to be machne Yerusha, or perhaps in the case of Nedarim to effectuate a konam on something that doesn't exist in the world. And basically, he's going to offer 3 different approaches. Usually a chakir is made of 2 different approaches. In this case, it's like a flow chart. Once you have the 2 approaches, we'll call them Roman numeral number 1 and Roman numeral number 2. Then we take Roman numeral number 2 and we break it down into 2 possibilities. So what is let's say the first chakira, and then we'll get to the second chakira. What are the 2 interpretations of why Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam is not subject to a kinyan? And he's going to quote the Tashbeitz on the bottom right of page Nun Beis. That's the first page that you have in Marocha Ayin Ches. But before we see the Tashbeitz, this is a simple point of interest which I'm fascinated by, and that's the Mabit. The Mabit who lived approximately 6 centuries ago. In my youth, we used to say 5 centuries ago. But the Mabit tells us that this halacha of Ein Adam Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam is actually a Gzeras HaKosav. Nowhere in Shas does the Gemara say Minani Mili with regard to Ein Adam Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. But the Mabit creates a minolan where it doesn't exist. And he says, Kol kinyan, the Torah repeats itself with regard to every single kinyan, that there's got to be a davar matzui. It's got to be something that exists in the world at the time of the sale. For example, with regard to kinyan kesef, the pasuk says, with regard to Avraham Avinu and so forth and so on, Nasati kesef hasada. So there's a sada. You're selling a sada. Right? A stay-afron, there is a sada. Or, for example, in Hegdesh, it says v'kamlo, that he gives kesef, and v'kamlo, meaning there's something kayam. Or v'chisimkru memkar amisecha, there's a memkar, there's a davar be'en, there's something that exists. But if it's a davar she'lo ba leolam, then it's not included in any of the parshiyos of kinyan. And that leads me to believe, which I'm not sure if that's what he's going to say, but if he says it's Obar Shakivanti, that we're not talking about a discussion of smichus das, right? Every kinyan is made of 3 different elements. There are 3 different kinyanim, besides the machna and the kona, of course. Number 1, you need das, and that's a 2-fold requirement of das machna and das kona. Number 2, you need a chefetz, an object that's being transferred. And number 3, you need a Masechet. wherein lies the chisaron of a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam? One could ostensibly argue that the chisaron is in das. You don't know whether this thing is going to come to the world, it's not going to come to the world, and even if you know for sure it will be created, it will emerge, but right now it doesn't exist in the world, and you don't really have gemiras das on something that does not exist. I would argue, Lefi ani isdaiti, that if so, and if the chisaron here is smichas das, I don't need a pasuk for that. But rather I need a gzeres hakasa because I'm going way beyond smichas hadas. I'm claiming that there's something much more fundamental that's lacking in a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam than just simple gemiras das, that he has an absolute ratzon and he has decided with a full-fledged heart that he wants to effectuate this kinyan. What could be more fundamental than smichas das? That's, I think, what the Mabit is asking. If it was only an issue of smichas das, I don't need psukim. That's a psychological umdana that we can determine within the realm of halacha without a pasuk, without a gzeres hakosov. But the gzeres hakosov is going beyond the problem of smichas das. And what I'm trying to suggest here is that even in a case of a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, and you'll convince me that there's smichas das. Let's say, for example, if you're growing oranges in California, I don't know, just throwing out a possibility, year in and year out, for the last 1,000 years, your trees have been producing oranges. So even if I'm selling you oranges that don't exist yet, I have gemiras das. I mean, I think modern contemporary financial law would probably substantiate this. I mean, Google this and tell me if I'm right, that if a company were to sell its produce, in the case, let's say, of California oranges, before the oranges have already grown on the tree, it would be a binding contract. Am I right or wrong? I don't know. What's your intuition? I'm going to assume, for argument's sake, just for the sake of the shir, that al pi svara, that would constitute smichas das. We would not claim that he was fooled, that he wasn't sure about the kinyan. He signed a contract with 2 witnesses or whatever they require and a notarized document that he's selling his produce to so-and-so. I mean, Tropicana orange juice probably is sold way before the oranges are on the tree. So that would give me a definite smichas das, and yet there would be a loch of ein adam makni Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. And that's where the Mabit, I think, jumps in and needs gzeres hakosov. So let's take a look at the Tashbeitz. The Tashbeitz is our first, I call it Roman numeral number 1, our first explicit breakthrough to give us the reason why ein adam makni Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Kevon de b'shas hakinyan ein malahaknos. In other words, there's no chefta. If there's no chefta, then there's no ma'aseh kinyan. In other words, a kinyan has to be chal on an object. And if the object doesn't exist, then the kinyan can't be chal. And it seems to me that that presentation and that definition of Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam is way, way beyond the confines of a chisaron of gemiras das. Because, again, as I said before, you may convince us that he's absolutely committed to this kinyan, even though it's a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, and yet, according to the Tashbeitz, the kinyan would not be chal. Why? Because it cannot be chal without a chefta, without something that exists in the world that lends itself to a kinyan. That's numeral number 1, and I would like to make a connection here between the Tashbeitz and the Mabit. However, Roman numeral number 2, on the left column, Aval Yesh Me'arishonim, there are other Rishonim that say that Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, why can't it be chal when the object comes into the world? Meaning, if I sell you the oranges on my tree and the oranges don't exist, then the kinyan should be chal immediately with the emergence of the oranges on the tree. And that would obviate and circumvent the problem that the Tashbeitz is raising here. How could you have a chalos kinyan on a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam? Where's the ma'aseh kinyan? What are you transferring? It's not in the world. But the answer is, I'm doing a Maisa Kinyan now, which will be chal on the object when the object comes into the world. So why is that also excluded under Ein Adam Makneh? So the Rishonim say that Ein Achisaron Ela Machma She'ein Lahem Smichus Das, that right now the Maisa Kinyan that you effectuate on something that doesn't exist has not been a product of your absolute commitment and decision to effectuate that Kinyan. And those Rishonim, amongst them the Muki Yosef in Bab Metzia, and the Rush and the Tosas Rush in Baba Basra, they quote the case of Makna Libno Ubar. He has a future son. Right now, his son is in an embryonic stage in his mother's womb, and he maknas something to his Ubar. And this should come under the principle of Ein Adam Makna Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, because even though he's being maknas something that exists, but we also need a recipient of the Kinyan, and there is no recipient of the Kinyan because right now the son is still what? He's an Ubar. And the Gemara explains why is it that according to that opinion, a person could be makna an effective Kinyan to an Ubar, his son, Hoel v'daito shel Adam krova eitzel b'no. That's the Gemara's language. So the Shita Mekubetzes quotes the Tosas Rosh Mikan Nireh Taima. The reason for Ein Adam Makna Lid Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. That's the right girsa here because the Uber is a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. But again, he's bequeathing him mammon, a table, a chair, a sada, which is in the world, but to a person who doesn't exist yet. He hasn't been born yet. And the answer is, says the Tosas Rosh, Mishum delo gamar umakna. You can't be more explicit than that. Now notice, please, that at this point in our discussion, we are combining and equating two different categories of Ein Adam Makna Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. In one case, it's a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, and it's another case that's called Lid Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. And the presentation here, which is based on the Nemuki Yosef Bab Metzia and the Tosas Rosh quoted by the Shita in Bab Basra, is based on that equation. If we're going to say Ein Adam Makna Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, the oranges on the tree have not been produced yet, and we're going to assume that that's because lo gamar umakna, meaning there's no smichas das. We're going to derive that from the case of Adam Makna Libno Ha'ubar, meaning that because Daito Shalom Krova Eitzel Beno, that's why the Kinyan is Chal. If we didn't have Daito Shalom Adam Krova and there was no smichas das, he could not be makna to an Uber. So if I want to be makna something to your Uber, that Kinyan will not be Chal. And that halacha is equivalent and identical with Ein Adam Makna Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Now, what I have for you here, and another page I want to give out, is a very, very rare sefer. It's not so rare, but in the yeshiva world, it's quite rare. I'm not sure if they have it in Mishkan Tzipora, and that's called Shiurei Rabbeinu Chaim Halevi. And this sefer, I'll tell you a quick story. I don't know if you like stories, but Rav Soloveitchik in one of the shiurim during my 5-year period in the Shia, he brought in a notebook. It was one of those, black, what do they call those? Those, the old style notebooks. Anyway.
It's something with a C, like Compa.
I don't know.
They're the ones with black
anyway,
and white.
So what was in that notebook? The handwriting of Reb Chaim, his grandfather.
Oh my God.
And you see, when he brought it in, like the whole shir, 100 guys are leaning over. Everybody wants to see Reb Chaim's handwriting, the actual Ksav Yad of Reb Chaim. I clean myself of this disease, but I used to be very diseased about buying antiques and so forth, Sfarim, old Sfarim. I have, Baruch Hashem, a nice collection. In any event, you can't imagine the excitement, of seeing Reb Chaim's Ksav. Everyone's looking over. Anyway, at some point after the Shir, Rav Soloveitchik had to go to the washroom, and he gives the notebook over to his grandson, Rav Moshe Chorsky, Zechron Livracha. So I said to Reb Moshe, can I just look at the notebook? That's all I want. He said, I don't think my grandfather would be happy about that. He was a shomer, shomer of something very valuable, and he understood that he. Anyway, from that notebook, we have this book, because posthumously, after the Rav died, there was a decision made by the family to publish this notebook. Now, keep in mind that this was published as a joint effort between two of Rav Moshe Soloveitchik's grandchildren. That's Rav Moshe Meiselman and Rav Yitzchak Lichtenstein. Rav Yitzchak Lichtenstein is now Rosh Hashiva in Torah Das, which is really interesting. That's a different discussion, not for now. But be that as it may, they produced this book, which is based on the Ksav Yad of Reb Chaim. These are shiurim that Reb Chaim gave in Volozhin. That's before he became the Rav in Brisk. And it's really ancient. So you have a photocopy of 2 pages from this book. Am I right?
And you can't get it in farm store?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. Maybe by now you could get it. I don't know. I have it for, since it was printed. But it's a very exciting opportunity to go into the youth of Reb Chaim. And many people claim that what Reb Chaim wrote in his youth is a lot clearer than the Chidushei Hagon Reb Chaim al Rambam, which he wrote when he was in his 60s. But be that as it may, if you see I made an arrow so you know which page is the first page, it's actually Tesvav. Now Reb Chaim is dealing with a sugya in Bav Metzia Daf Tes Zayin. And in the Gemara in Bav Metzia Daf Tes Zayin, a man sells a piece of karka with a shtar to a buyer who paid full price. Only one little problem. The mocher doesn't own that karka. It's stolen karka. And the Gemara wants to know whether or not, if the Gazlan would now go ahead and purchase the karka legally from its nigzal, from its original owner, would the shtar mecher in the hands of the lokeach who bought it from the Gazlan be a valid shtar that would give him ownership over the karka?
This is kind of an interesting tangent of Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam.
Exactly.
Right? Like
and Reb Chaim is going to analyze Tosfos, because the Gemara says that there is a svara to say that the shtar mecher in the hands of the lokech would be valid, and that when the Gazlan buys the karka legally, subsequent to his selling it to the lokeach, the shtar now is a valid shtar, effectuating the kinyan of the lokeach, which was purchased from a Gazlan with stolen goods. And the Gemara gives a svara called Tehebim Amino Bahi Anod Kamehemenle Gomer Umaknile. Now, what the Gemara is trying to solve here is the problem of Ein Adam Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. At the time of the Mecher, clearly, the Gazlan, did not own the karka. How in the world can we effectuate that kinyan and validate it when it was a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam? And the Gemara gives a svara called Tehebim Amino, without going into all the nitty-gritty details of what Tehebim Amino means, but it means that the mocher, who's the Gazlan, has a certain kind of gemiras das, that if he can ever validate this kinyan and clear his reputation, and the lokeach is willing to rely on him and put his money on the table, he's going to pay 1,000,000 shekel, knowing full well that the Gazlan will ultimately effectuate that kinyan. And how could he effectuate the kinyan? By buying the karka legally from its owner. So the kinyan now, or shall I call it the mechira or the hakna of the Gazlan to the nigzal, even though it's a kinyan on a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, has a gemiras das to it. And Reb Chaim is going to analyze Tosfos, who raises the following question. This whole sugi Bav Metzia is Rav, And Tosfos says in the name of Rav Hai Gaon, Rav holds Adam Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. And Tosfos rejects Rav Hai Gaon. You'll see in the paragraph BIyun Tosfos Sham, Sheviu Shitas Rav Hai Gaon, the Kolzu Rak Rav Litame, right? Rav L'Shitaso, this relay Adam Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Like Rabbi Meir, V'ali Bey, according to Rav, Hu de Mechalkina ben Heicha de Samcha Daita leHeicha de Lo Samcha Daita, which means that according to Rav, Adam Makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. But you'll ask me, well, wait a minute, there's no Smichas Das, and the answer is, if I can prove to you and establish that there's Smichas Das, then the Kinyan would be Chal on a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Aval Didan argues Tosfos, we don't accept Rav. V'kaimel into ein other makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Lo mahanya mashisamcha daite. Smichas das would not be sufficient, and therefore Tosfos rejects Rav Hai Gaon. Usfirale, since the Gemara here should be accepted lahalacha, and the Rambam holds that this strange kind of kinyan of a gazlan to a lokeach of a stolen property is valid. The Rambam validates that, even though the Rambam paskins against Rav, ain't on the makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. So again, just to summarize, we don't know how to reconcile the interpretation of Rav Hai Gaon, according to whom we're dealing with the Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, but Rav holds Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam is a valid kinyan. But how are we going to reconcile that with the fact that we paskin that Gomer Umakna, that there is a smichus das because behem mino, and that's going to validate the kinyan, and the lokeach has the shtar mecher? How do we reconcile that with the fact that we paskin ain't on the makna Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam? Vanira Lomar, again, I guess if the lights went off, that's a pretty clear indication that we're going into overtime. So let's see if we could just get through this next paragraph. Hanira Lomar al Pimai de Isa bebabasr daf kuf mem beis. Omar Rav Nachman amazaka li ubar lo kana, but l'chateled kana, he can transfer ownership of his property to the ubar, and even though it's Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, but nevertheless he'll be chal with the leda of the ubar. The Kosev Shamar Rashbam. Af agad Rav Nachman tzvilei mocher peres dekel lechaver v'yomar af kisher ba LeOlam yochel lachsbo, meaning Rav Nachman holds that ein other makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, even if what? Even if he knows that it's going to come into existence, like for example, Peros dekel, but he could be chozerbo and the kinyan is not chal, even when the Peros emerge. And yet hacha gabi ubar. In the case of Ubar, it's the same Rav Nachman who in Bava Basra on Daf Kuf Mem Beis says Chashiv Le Ki Yeshno Ba'olam, that this person is Ki'ilu Ba'olam when he's in Ubar. El Shetzarach L'Takin L'Shona V'Loma L'Chsheteled, that the kinyan would be Chal when the child is born. The Azroi Liknos L'Gamre. Hare, we see the Rashbam Machalik. How can you accept this Rashbam that Peros dekel, you cannot be makne even when the Peros will come into the world, and the kinyan is not valid even when the kinyan should be chal after the Peros emerge, because ain't on the makne Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, and yet you can be makne to the ubar, and that kinyan will be chal when the ubar is born. Says Reb Chaim, there are two categories of Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. The object that you're transferring doesn't exist in the world. Like the case, by the way, of the fruits on the tree, they don't exist at all. That which he's being makna exists in the world. And the reason for that is because an ubar does not have a yad l'kinyonim. And here's where the Rashbam's distinction comes to play. That's an absolute halacha. But if there's a technical reason why the kinyan chal, there's no rishus of a kona or a makne, But if he makes a t'nai, that the kinyan should be chal be'esha yuchal lachul k'gon ksheteled, then it'll be chal. And why is that? Because daito shel adam krova eitzel b'no. So it means that Reb Chaim is asking the question whether the problem of Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam is a chisaron in smichas das, or it's a fundamental principle that the chisaron is you don't have a davar on nikneh. And Reb Chaim says the following: that in the case of Peros, Dekel, that's a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. Let me start the other way around. In the case of Maknalu Ubar, the davar is kayam; it exists in the world. We can make a Masechet kinyan on that object. Just the problem is that you need a kone, and that kone has to be roy liknos. And in the case of an uber, he's not roy liknos. But you want to make a kinyan that be chal when the uber is born and he's roy liknos. That kinyan could be chal if you solve the problem of what? Of smichus das. And therefore, the case of daito shel adam krov eitzel b'no, the kinyan will be chal because the davar, the object that's being transferred, exists in the world. But in the case of an object that doesn't exist in the world, and he wants to effectuate a kinyan, that would be chal when the peros emerge on the tree. In that case, it's a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam, and there's a more fundamental problem. And that is that even if you convince me that the Paris is going to come and he certainly has Gemiras Das, like the case we gave in contemporary contract law, nevertheless, the kinyan can't be chal because there's no Masechet kinyan. You can't do a Masechet kinyan if the object that you're transferring doesn't exist. And therefore, whatever you'll say, it's just Dvar B'alma, it's Mili, and it's not a kinyan. So this, I think, is Reb Chaim's response to the two approaches here in this essay. Why is a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam not chal? Is it because ein al mal liknos? You can't do a Masechet kinyan on something that doesn't exist, or is it chisaron smichas das? And Reb Chaim says there are two different halachas. There are two different categories of Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam. One is a category of something that doesn't exist in the world, and the other is there's a technical problem in Hilchas Kinyanim. And when you have a technical problem in Hilchas Kinyanim, but the davar exists, you can do a Masechet kinyan on the davar that exists. Now we have a problem of smichus das, and if I can convince you that he has das, then the kinyan will be chal. But you can't do a Masechet kinyan on a Davar She'lo Ba LeOlam klal. So that I thought was a brilliant chiddush of Reb Chaim. Again, how many different kashas Reb Chaim is going to answer with that yisod, that you'll have to read the rest of the article, and that'll be homework for next time. Okay, then, so we'll decide in Mr. Hashem whether or not we want to do one more shir in Nedarim or just go on to Masechet Nazir.
Do we lose the intro to Nedarim if we push it off another week? I would not.
The intro to Nazir.
To Nazir, sorry. I mean, maybe we could show a time saying.
All right, maybe we
even
could
though
split it in
like
half.
a few days behind.
That's
Okay.
exactly what I was thinking. I would love the intro to Nazir.